The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky outcrop where the Homo erectus band had made their temporary camp. Smoke should have been rising from the central fire pit, but instead, only cold grey ashes remained scattered in the wind. The other members of the hunter-gatherer band moved quietly around the camp, their heavy brows furrowed with concern as they glanced toward the motionless figure curled beside the dead embers. Kira lay on her side, her robust frame wrapped in the torn hide that had once belonged to Jorak, her mate. Her thick, calloused hands clutched the fur against her chest, and her deep-set eyes stared blankly at the charred remains of what had been their life-giving flame. 3 sunrises had passed since the hunting party returned without him, since they told her how the great cat had taken him in the deep ravine where no one could reach his body. Kira. The voice belonged to Nala, an older female whose weathered face bore the scars of countless seasons. She approached slowly, carrying a crude bowl made from a hollowed gourd. Steam rose from the broth within. "You must eat." Kira didn't respond. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but otherwise she remained as still as the stones around her. The ashes had worked their way into her matted hair, coating her dark skin with a fine layer of grey dust that made her look like a ghost among the living. Nala crouched beside her, her joints creaking with the effort. "The young ones ask for you," she said softly. "Wren found honey yesterday. Sweet honey, the kind Jorak loved, the kind you both would share after successful hunts." At the mention of her mate's name, Kira's fingers tightened on the hide, her knuckles whitening. Their low sound escaped her throat, not quite a moan, not quite a growl, but something primal and broken that made Nala's own eyes glisten with unshed tears. The camp buzzed with quiet activity around them. Borak, one of the younger hunters, napped flint with sharp, rhythmic strikes. His broad shoulders tensed with each blow, and he kept glancing toward the tree line where the morning foraging party should have already departed. Without Kira's exceptional tracking skills, they were forced to rely on less experienced eyes to find the hidden roots and medicinal plants that sustained them through the harsh seasons. "The rains will come soon," Nala continued, setting the bowl within Kira's reach. "We need to move to the winter caves before the great waters flood the valley. You know this place better than any of us. Your eyes see what others miss." But Kira's eyes saw nothing now except the memories that played behind her closed lids. Jorak's confident stride as he led the hunt, his gentle hands as he helped her prepare the evening meal, the way his deep voice would rumble through their shared sleeping furs on cold nights, telling stories of successful hunts and dreams of the territory they would claim for their future offspring. Young Tem, barely past his first growth spurt, approached hesitantly. His gangly limbs still bore the awkwardness of youth, but his eyes held a wisdom beyond his seasons. He had been like a son to Kira and Jorak, orphaned early and taken in by their kindness. "Kira," he whispered, his voice cracking. I found his spear yesterday, down by the water where the hunting party crossed. It was caught in the reed beds." He held out a familiar wooden shaft, its stone point still sharp and deadly. I thought you might want it." For the first time in 3 days, Kira's eyes moved. They fixed on the weapon that had been an extension of Jorak's will, his primary tool for providing for their small family unit within the larger band. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, fingers tracing the smooth wood that had been polished by countless hunts and her mate's calloused grip. "He fought," Tem said quietly. "The marks on the spear shaft. He fought hard before the end." Kira pulled the spear against her chest alongside Jorak's hide, and for a moment the camp fell completely silent, except for the distant call of a hunting bird and the whisper of wind through the acacia trees that dotted their temporary home. The weight of collective grief and uncertainty pressed down on the small band like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. The 4th day brought troubling signs that even the youngest members of the band could not ignore. Grok, the alpha male whose massive frame and battle-scarred hide commanded respect throughout their territory, stood at the edge of their rocky shelter scanning the horizon with growing unease. His thick brow ridge cast deep shadows over his dark eyes as he watched the morning foraging party return, with barely enough roots and berries to fill a single gathering pouch. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the drought-stricken landscape that stretched endlessly beyond their temporary camp. Withered grasses crunched underfoot, and the once reliable stream that had drawn them to this location now ran as little more than a muddy trickle. The acacia trees that dotted the savanna stood like ancient sentinels, their branches bare and brittle, offering no shade from the relentless heat that seemed to press down on everything with suffocating intensity. Not good, muttered Bren, an experienced hunter whose left arm bore the permanent marks of an old cave bear encounter. He dumped his meager collection of tubers at Grok's feet, each root smaller and more wizened than they should have been at this time of season. The good patches. Other bands got there first, signs everywhere, too many footprints, too much digging, ground torn up like a battlefield. Grok's massive hands clenched into fists as he examined the pitiful harvest. His knuckles, scarred from countless battles with predators and rival hunters, whitened with the pressure of his grip. Competition with neighboring hunter-gatherer bands had intensified as the dry season stretched longer than usual, far beyond what the oldest members could remember. The reliable water sources were drying up one by one, forcing all the groups in the region to converge on the few remaining springs and fertile gathering areas. Without Kira's keen eye for hidden food sources and her knowledge of secret waterholes passed down through generations of her lineage, they were at a severe disadvantage. Young Lyra, barely past her first bleeding, approached with tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Her small hands trembled as she held out a handful of withered grass seeds, their normally plump kernels reduced to hollow shells. The grain hills, they're empty, Grok. All the good seeds are gone. Other bands took everything. Even the emergency caches we marked last season. Someone found them and cleaned them out. Her voice broke as she spoke, the weight of responsibility too heavy for her young shoulders. She had been learning the foraging ways from Kira, absorbing the older female's vast knowledge of which plants could sustain life and which could bring death. Now with her teacher lost in grief, Lyra felt the terrifying burden of feeding her people with skills she had barely begun to master. Behind her, old Mac hobbled forward on legs that had carried him through more seasons than anyone could count. His grizzled beard was stained with the remnants of their dwindling food stores, and his sunken eyes held the weight of hard-earned wisdom accumulated through decades of surviving in this harsh landscape. "Storm clouds gathering to the south," he wheezed, pointing with a gnarled finger toward the darkening horizon, where thunderheads built like mountains of angry spirits. "Big storm. Maybe 2, 3 days. Lightning, flooding, wind that can tear shelter apart. We need proper caves, need food stored deep, need to move soon before the rains trap us in open ground." Grok's gaze shifted to where Kira still lay motionless beside the cold fire pit, her form barely distinguishable from the grey stones that surrounded their shelter. Her once powerful frame seemed to have shrunk in on itself, muscles that had once tracked prey across vast distances, now slack and wasted. The grey ash coating her skin made her blend into the rocky ground like a corpse already claimed by the earth, and the sight filled him with a frustration that made his muscles tense and his breathing grow heavy. The camp buzzed with increasingly frantic activity as the other band members prepared for the coming storm and the inevitable move to better shelter. Borak worked desperately with damp kindling, trying to coax flame from wood that seemed determined to resist. Sparks flew from his efforts, but no fire caught, leaving them without the warmth and protection that had been their constant companion since the earliest days of their kind. "Enough," Grok growled, his voice carrying the authority that had kept their band alive through countless dangers. He strode toward Kira with purposeful steps, each footfall echoing off the stone walls of their shelter like the approach of thunder. "Kira, up." She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his presence, as if his words were just another sound in the growing wind. Grok crouched beside her, his bulk blocking out the morning light and casting her deeper into shadow. "Your mate is gone," he said bluntly, his words cutting through the humid air like a flint blade. "But his cubs live, his band lives. You think Jorak would want you to let us all starve while you sleep in dead ashes?" A shudder ran through Kira's body, the first movement she had made in hours, but still she remained curled in her ball of grief and ash. Her breathing became more ragged, as if his words had penetrated some small part of the wall she had built around her heart. Nala approached cautiously, placing a weathered hand on Grok's thick shoulder. Her own eyes were red with unshed tears, for she too had lost a mate many seasons ago, and remembered the crushing weight of that particular darkness. "She needs time," she whispered. "Grief has its own season, its own rhythm. Force it, and you risk breaking something that can't be mended." "Time we don't have," Grok rumbled back, but his voice carried less edge than before. He had seen this kind of deep mourning before, had watched other members of past bands disappear into themselves after losing mates or offspring to the countless dangers that stalked their daily existence. Some never returned from that dark place, eventually walking away from the band to face the wilderness alone. Others eventually emerged, often harder and more valuable than before, forged by suffering into something stronger than they had been. The fifth morning arrived with an ominous stillness that made even the most experienced hunters pause and listen to the unnatural quiet. No birds sang from the skeletal branches of the drought-withered trees, and the usual chorus of insects had fallen silent, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Grok emerged from the shallow cave where he had spent a restless night, his massive form casting long shadows in the early light as he surveyed their increasingly precarious situation. The air itself felt different, heavier, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his thick arms stand upright. To the south, the storm clouds had grown into towering monuments of black and grey that stretched from the horizon to the heavens, their pregnant bellies swollen with the promise of violent rain and destructive winds. Lightning flickered within their depths like trapped spirits, and the distant rumble of thunder grew steadily closer with each passing hour. But it was not the approaching storm that made Grok's scarred hands tighten around his bone-tipped spear. Fresh tracks scarred the dusty ground around their camp, paw prints larger than a man's hand, with claw marks that gouged deep furrows in the hard-packed earth, the unmistakable sign of a cave lion, and not just any lion, but a massive male whose territory they had apparently wandered into during their desperate search for food and water. "Bren!" Grok called softly to his most trusted hunter, who was already crouched beside the tracks with his weathered face creased in concentration. The older hunter's damaged arm hung useless at his side, but his remaining hand traced the edges of the paw prints with the delicate touch of someone reading a story written in earth and stone. "Big male," Bren confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Old scar on right front paw. See here where the pad doesn't press full to ground? This one has killed before, many times. Tracks circle our camp 3 times in the night. He was testing us, learning our smells, counting our numbers." His dark eyes met Grok's with grim understanding. "He knows we're weak, wounded prey." The realization sent a chill through the camp that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Several of the younger band members clustered closer to the adults, their primitive instincts screaming warnings about the invisible predator that had stalked them while they slept. Little Fen, barely old enough to walk steady, whimpered and pressed against Nala's legs, her small hands clutching at the older woman's hide wrappings. "How long since he passed?" Grok asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the sharp edges of the tracks and the way the disturbed dust still held its shape. "Not long. Maybe one hand of sun movement before dawn. He's close, watching from high rocks or thick brush." Bren stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. Cave lions don't usually hunt bands this size, but with the drought, he gestured toward their pitifully small food stores and the obvious signs of their weakened state. Desperate times make all predators bolder. Across the camp, Kira remained motionless in her nest of ash and sorrow, seemingly oblivious to the new threat that circled their small family like death itself. Her once keen senses, which had warned them of dangers both animal and human countless times before, now turned inward to feed on her grief. The irony was not lost on Grok. At the moment when they most needed her legendary tracking abilities and wilderness instincts, she had disappeared into a place where their desperate calls could not reach her. Young Tem approached hesitantly, Jorak's spear still clutched in his trembling hands. His adolescent frame had grown tall quickly, but muscle and experience had not yet caught up to his height, leaving him awkward and uncertain in his movements. "Grok, should I try to wake her again? Tell her about the lion?" His voice cracked with the strain of carrying responsibilities far beyond his seasons. "Let sleeping grief lie," Old Mac advised from his seat beside the dead fire pit, where he worked methodically to sharpen stone points with hands that had performed this task thousands of times. "Fear will wake her when words cannot. The nose knows danger, even when the heart refuses to see." His ancient eyes, clouded with the white films of age, nonetheless seemed to see more clearly than anyone else's. "But we cannot wait for her awakening to prepare our defenses." The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, a musky predatory smell that made every primitive alarm in their brains start screaming. Somewhere in the rocks above their shelter, or perhaps in the thick brush that lined the nearby ravine, yellow eyes were watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The cave lion had chosen his hunting ground well, positioning himself upwind where his scent would reach them just before he attacked. Borak finally managed to coax a small flame from his tinder, and the sight of fire brought a momentary sense of security to the huddled band. But they all knew that their small blaze would provide little protection against a determined predator. especially one driven to desperation by the same drought that plagued their own daily existence. Fire could delay an attack, perhaps, but only strong spears and coordinated tactics could save them if the great cat decided to charge. "We need to move," Grok announced, his decision cutting through the morning air with finality. "Storm comes from south, lion prowls from north. We go east, toward the river caves. Higher ground, better shelter, water that might still run clean." He looked around at their meager possessions, calculating what could be carried quickly and what would have to be abandoned. "Take only what keeps us alive. Food, water, weapons, fire-making tools. Leave everything else." The band began to move with the efficient desperation of people who had fled from danger many times before. But as they gathered their few precious belongings, every eye occasionally turned toward Kira, still curled beside the cold ashes of their former security. The unspoken question hung in the air like smoke. Would their strongest tracker rise to help them navigate the dangerous journey ahead, or would grief claim her life as surely as the cave lion's claws had claimed her mates? The first fat raindrops struck the dusty ground like tiny explosions, sending up puffs of parched earth that had not tasted moisture in countless days. Within moments, the scattered drops became a steady patter, then a driving downpour that transformed the drought-hardened landscape into a treacherous maze of slippery rocks and rapidly forming streams. The band huddled beneath a shallow overhang of stone, their meager possessions clutched close to their bodies as they watched their world transform before their eyes. Grok pressed himself against the rock wall, his massive frame providing shelter for young Fen and two other children who shivered against his bulk. Water cascaded from the stone ledge above them in a curtain that turned their already limited view into a grey blur of movement and noise. Through the torrent he could barely make out the shapes of his scattered band members, each family group seeking whatever protection they could find among the broken terrain. "The ravine will flood," Nala shouted over the thunderous roar of rain striking stone, her weathered face creased with worry as she pointed toward the dry creek bed that lay between them and the river caves they desperately needed to reach. "Water comes fast in places like this. Could be waist deep before we know it, strong enough to sweep away a full-grown hunter." Lightning split the sky with brilliant white fire, illuminating the landscape in stark detail for a brief, terrifying moment. In that instant of clarity, Grok saw what made his blood turn to ice in his veins. A golden form crouched on the rocks above them, perfectly motionless despite the driving rain. Yellow eyes reflected the lightning's glow like twin suns, and for one heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across the storm-lashed distance. Thunder crashed overhead with such force that little Fen screamed and buried her face against Grok's chest, her small body trembling with terror at the violence of the sky's fury. When the echoes faded and Grok looked again toward the high rocks, the cave lion had vanished like a nightmare dispelled by dawn. But he knew with absolute certainty that those watching eyes had not gone far. The great cat was simply using the storm as cover, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at prey, made clumsy and desperate by fear and weather. Across their small shelter, Kira remained curled in her ball of grief, but now the cold rain had begun to soak through Jorak's hide and her own matted hair. Water dripped steadily from her face, mixing her tears with the sky's weeping, until it became impossible to tell where sorrow ended and storm began. Her lips moved constantly now, though no sound emerged. Perhaps prayers to spirits her people barely understood, or perhaps endless repetitions of her dead mate's name. "We have to move her," Bren called out from his own precarious shelter, wedged between two boulders. "Storm's getting worse, not better. If we wait much longer, we'll be trapped here until the waters recede. Could be days, and that lion won't wait for good weather to make his kill." His scarred face was grim as he studied the rapidly deepening pools that were already beginning to form in the lower ground around them. Tem crawled forward through the driving rain, still clutching Jorak's spear like a lifeline. The wooden shaft had grown slick with moisture, making it difficult to maintain his grip, but he refused to let go of the last tangible connection to the hunter who had been like a father to him. "Kira!" he called, his young voice nearly lost in the storm's fury. "Kira, please, the children are scared. They need you. We all need you." For the first time since Jorak's death, Kira's eyes opened fully. They were bloodshot and swollen with weeping, but they focused on the boy's face with something approaching awareness. Her cracked lips parted, and a sound emerged. Not words, but a low keening that seemed to harmonize with the wind's howl. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart, raw and primal and filled with such pain that even old Mac, who had witnessed more death than any of them, turned away in sympathy. "Jorak," she whispered, her voice so quiet that Tem had to lean close to hear her over the storm. Jorak would not let the cubs suffer. Her hand moved slowly, painfully, to touch the boy's rain-soaked cheek. His cubs, our cubs. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in its brief illumination they all saw the water level rising with alarming speed in the ravine below. What had been a trickle an hour ago was now a rushing torrent that carried branches, stones, and debris in its angry current. Soon it would be impossible to cross, trapping them on the wrong side of the gorge with a hungry predator, and no adequate shelter from the storm's growing violence. "Now!" Grok commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had led his people through countless crises. "We move now, while we still can. Bren, take point with your good spear. Mac, stay with the children in the middle. Everyone else form a circle around them." He looked directly at Kira, his dark eyes boring into hers with desperate intensity. "Can you walk?" Slowly, painfully, like a creature emerging from a long hibernation, Kira began to uncurl herself from her nest of ash and grief. Her movements were uncertain, her legs trembling from days of disuse, but something in her ancient survival instincts had finally awakened to the immediate danger surrounding them. She accepted Tem's offered hand and pulled herself to her feet, swaying slightly as the world spun around her. "The secret path," she said suddenly, her voice gaining strength as forgotten knowledge surfaced through the fog of her sorrow. "There's a secret path up the cliff face. Jorak and we found it during the Great Flood 3 seasons past. Narrow, dangerous, but it leads to the high caves, above where the lion prowls." Her eyes, still red with grief, nonetheless began to show the first spark of their old sharpness. "I can find it, even in this storm, even in the dark." Hope flickered through the band like lightning. Brief, but brilliant. If Kira's memory was true, if her legendary pathfinding skills had not been completely consumed by grief, they might yet escape both predator and flood. But the journey would be treacherous beyond measure, requiring them to navigate slippery rocks and narrow ledges while the storm raged around them and death stalked their every step. The narrow ledge that Kira led them to seemed impossible, a crack in the cliff face barely wide enough for a single person, slick with rain and moss, stretching upward into the storm-darkened sky like a scar across the stone. The howling wind threatened to tear them from the rock face with every step, and below them the flooded ravine churned with debris and foam, waiting to claim anyone who lost their grip on the treacherous handholds. Kira pressed herself against the wet stone, her fingers finding purchase in crevices that seemed invisible to the others. Despite days of weakness and grief, her body remembered the ancient skills that had kept her alive through countless dangers. Each placement of hand and foot was deliberate, calculated, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of her lineage, who had learned to read stone and wind, like others read tracks in soft earth. "Here," she called back to the others, her voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "Jorak carved this handhold during our first crossing. See the marks?" Her fingers traced the deliberate gouges in the rock where her dead mate had chipped away stone to create a more secure grip. The sight of his handiwork, still sharp and functional after 3 seasons, sent a fresh wave of pain through her chest, but also something else, a fierce determination not to let his efforts be wasted. Tem followed immediately behind her, Jorak's spear strapped awkwardly across his back, where it interfered with his movement, but refused to be left behind. His adolescent frame was all angles and uncertainty, making the climb doubly dangerous as his long limbs struggled to find the rhythm that came naturally to the more experienced adults. "I can't see the next hold," he gasped, rain streaming down his face and into his eyes. "Feel, don't see," Kira instructed, her voice taking on the patient tone she had once used to teach him foraging techniques in happier times. "Stone speaks to fingers better than eyes. Trust what your hands tell you." She guided his trembling fingers to a small depression in the rock that would have been invisible in the storm's chaos. Jorak's hands found this same hold. His strength flows through the stone to yours. Behind them, the rest of the band stretched out in a desperate line along the cliff face. Grok's massive bulk made him the most vulnerable to the wind's attempts to tear him loose, but his incredible strength allowed him to find handholds that would have crumbled under lesser grips. He carried little Fen strapped to his chest with strips of hide, the child's terrified whimpers lost in the storm's roar as she pressed her face against his broad shoulder. Old Mac struggled more than any of them, his ancient joints protesting every movement, his gnarled fingers barely able to maintain their grip on the slippery stone. Can't hold much longer," he wheezed, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. One of his feet slipped, sending a shower of loose rock tumbling into the churning waters far below, and for a heart-stopping moment, his entire weight hung from his failing grip. Bren, climbing just below the elder, managed to wedge his good shoulder under Mac's feet, providing a temporary platform. "Rest a moment, old friend," he grunted, his own position precarious as he bore the additional weight. "Breathe. Find your strength again." The hunter's scarred face was a mask of concentration as he fought to maintain his balance while supporting another's weight. Lightning split the sky again, closer than before, and the thunder that followed seemed to shake the very cliff face they clung to. In the brilliant flash, Kira saw something that made her blood freeze. Fresh claw marks in the stone above them, gouged deep into the rock by talons the size of human fingers. The cave lion had found their secret path, had perhaps used it himself to reach the high caves they sought. They were climbing directly toward the predator's chosen hunting ground. "Faster," she urged, though she knew the others were already moving at the limit of their abilities. "We must reach the caves quickly now. The hunt comes from above." She didn't explain further, knowing that panic would be more dangerous than the lion itself on these narrow ledges, but she began to move with renewed urgency, her grief-weakened body finding reserves of strength she had thought lost forever. The path wound upward in a series of switchbacks, each turn offering a brief respite from the direct assault of wind and rain, but also concealing what lay ahead until the last moment. As they climbed higher, the storm seemed to grow in violence, as if the sky itself was angry at their attempt to escape the flood below. Hail began to mix with the rain, small stones of ice that stung exposed skin and made the already treacherous holds even more slippery. Nala, climbing with the sure-footed grace of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating difficult terrain, suddenly stopped and pressed herself flat against the rock. "Blood!" she called out, her voice tight with fear. "Fresh blood on the stone here, still warm despite the rain." Her weathered hands trembled as she examined the dark stains that painted the cliff face like primitive cave art. The implications hit them all at once. Something had died here recently, something large enough to leave such extensive bloodstains. Either the cave lion had made a kill on this very path, or another predator lurked ahead of them in the darkness. Either possibility meant their desperate gamble to reach safety might have delivered them directly into the jaws of death. "Keep climbing," Kira commanded, though her own voice shook with the effort of maintaining courage she did not feel. "Whatever happened here is finished. We face the dangers ahead, not the ghosts of what came before." But even as she spoke, her keen nose detected scents that made her primitive brain scream warnings. The metallic tang of fresh death, the musky odor of large predator, and something else, something wrong that she could not quite identify but that filled her with dread. Above them, barely visible through the storm's fury, the dark mouth of a cave yawned like the entrance to the underworld itself. Safety lay just ahead, but so did unknown terrors that might prove worse than the flood and lion they had fled. The secret path that had once represented salvation now felt like a ladder leading them toward their doom, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine whether their small band would see another sunrise. The cave mouth gaped before them like the maw of some ancient earth spirit, dark and forbidding, despite the promise of shelter it offered from the raging storm. As they hauled themselves over the final ledge and collapsed onto the blessed stability of solid ground, the smell hit them with overwhelming force. Death, old and new, mixed with the acrid scent of predator musk and something else that made their primitive instincts shriek warnings into the howling wind. Kira was the first to recover enough to investigate, her tracker's training overriding the exhaustion that made her limbs tremble and her lungs burn. She crept toward the cave entrance with movements that had become automatic after years of reading danger from shadows and silence. What she found there made her recoil so violently that she stumbled backward into Grok's solid bulk, her face pale as morning frost, despite the rain that still streamed down her cheeks. Bones. Everywhere, scattered across the cave floor like some macabre carpet, bleached white by time and weather. Rib cages that had once contained beating hearts. Leg bones that had carried desperate prey in futile flight. Skulls that stared with empty sockets toward the storm-lashed entrance. But these were not the random remains of natural death. They had been dragged here, arranged here, collected like trophies by something that took pleasure in the accumulation of its kills. "Cave bear," Bren whispered, his scarred face grim as he examined the massive claw marks that scored the walls near the entrance. "Old male, maybe. Big enough to drag whole kills up that cliff path we just climbed. This is his larder, his sleeping chamber." His damaged arm hung useless at his side, but his good hand gripped his spear with white-knuckled intensity, and somewhere in that darkness he might still be waiting. Grok moved protectively in front of the children, his massive frame forming a wall between them and whatever horrors lay deeper in the cave. Little Fen whimpered against his chest, her small hands clutching at his hide wrappings, as if she could burrow inside him and disappear completely. The other young ones pressed close to Nala, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the bone-littered floor that crunched underfoot with every step. Old Mac, despite his exhaustion from the terrible climb, forced himself to examine the scattered remains with the methodical attention of someone who had survived countless encounters with large predators. "Old bones, mostly," he observed, his ancient voice steady despite the circumstances. "Seasons old, some of them, but here," he pointed with his walking staff toward fresher remains near the back of the cave. "Recent kills. Days, maybe a hand of days. Blood still dark on some bones." The implications struck them all like a physical blow. Whatever lived in this cave was still actively hunting, still dragging prey up that impossible cliff path to feast in the shelter of stone walls. They had not found sanctuary, but had instead climbed directly into a predator's den, trading the uncertainty of storm and flood for the absolute certainty of teeth and claws waiting in the darkness ahead. "We can't stay here," Tem said, his young voice cracking with fear as he clutched Jorak's spear like a talisman against the horrors surrounding them. "If the bear comes back while we're trapped inside," he didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood that their small band would become just another layer of bones on this grisly floor. But even as he spoke, lightning illuminated the world outside with brilliant white fire, revealing the continuing fury of the storm that had driven them to this desperate shelter. The wind howled through the cave mouth like the voice of some angry spirit, and the rain drove horizontally with such force that it felt like being struck by countless tiny spears. To venture back onto that narrow cliff path in these conditions would be suicide as certain as facing whatever predator claimed this cave as home. Kira moved deeper into the cave despite the dangers, her tracker's instincts overriding fear as she read the story written in scattered bones and claw marks. "The bear is gone," she announced suddenly, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. "Look at the tracks, old tracks covered with dust and debris, and the freshest kills." She knelt beside a partially devoured carcass, studying the pattern of tooth marks and the way the flesh had been torn. "Not bear work. Too precise, too clean. This is cat work, lion work." The realization hit them like another thunderbolt. The cave lion they had fled below had not been stalking them randomly. He had been driving them, herding them like prey animals toward this very cave, this killing ground where he had already established his own hunting territory. The secret path that Kira remembered as salvation had become a trap, with the storm providing the perfect cover for the predator's strategy. "Clever hunter," Grok admitted grudgingly, his respect for the lion's intelligence warring with his fury at being outmaneuvered. "He knows these caves, knows the paths, knows where desperate prey will run when the waters rise." His massive hands clenched around his spear shaft until the knuckles showed white. "But he made one mistake. He drove us here together as a band. Strong hunters, experienced fighters. Not easy prey to take alone." Nala began gathering some of the smaller bones, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as she selected pieces that could serve as tools or weapons if needed. "If we must fight, we fight smart," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced death many times and lived to tell about it. "Use the cave walls to limit his approach. Keep the children in the deepest recess, where he cannot reach them easily." Deep in the cave's throat, something moved in the darkness, a shadow that seemed too large and too purposeful to be mere trick of flickering light. Yellow eyes reflected their small fire like twin stars, and a low growl echoed off the stone walls with such power that dust rained down from the ceiling above them. The cave lion had returned to his lair and found it occupied by the very prey he had spent so much effort to trap. The growl that rumbled from the cave's depths was unlike anything they had ever heard, a sound so deep and primal that it seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath their feet. It spoke of ancient power, of muscles coiled like massive springs, of fangs designed by countless generations of evolution to crush bone and tear flesh. The cave lion that emerged from the shadows was magnificent in its terrible beauty, a creature perfectly adapted for dealing death in the darkness. Grok stepped forward without hesitation, his massive frame positioned between the approaching predator and his vulnerable band members. His thick arms spread wide in a display of dominance that his species had used since time immemorial, making himself appear even larger and more threatening than his already impressive bulk suggested. The bone-tipped spear in his hands seemed pitifully small against the lion's overwhelming presence, but he held it with the steady confidence of someone who had faced death many times and refused to yield. "Stay back!" he roared, his voice echoing off the cave walls with such force that loose stones rattled down from the ceiling. The sound was part challenge, part warning, part desperate attempt to convince a superior predator that the cost of this attack would be too high to justify the meal. "We are not easy prey, we are hunters. We fight as one." The lion paused, its massive head tilting slightly as it studied this strange behavior. Most prey animals fled when confronted by its presence, or cowered in helpless terror while waiting for death to claim them. But these odd creatures stood their ground, forming a defensive circle with their young protected in the center, brandishing primitive weapons with the clear intent to use them. It was intriguing enough to make the great cat hesitate, calculating whether the potential injury was worth the feast these intruders represented. Behind Grok, Kira found herself moving with an automaticity that surprised her grief-fogged mind. Her hands selected stones from the bone-littered floor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to judge weight and balance in the space of a heartbeat. These were not random missiles but carefully chosen projectiles, each one tested for its ability to fly true and strike with maximum impact. The skills Jorak had taught her during their countless hunts together flowed through her movements like muscle memory, awakening from a deep sleep. "Kira," Tem whispered, his adolescent voice tight with fear and something that might have been hope. You're moving like yourself again, like before." His observation was accurate. For the first time since Jorak's death, her movements carried their old precision and deadly purpose, her grief temporarily burned away by the immediate need to protect the young ones who looked to her for survival. The lion took another step forward, its massive paws silent on the bone-strewn floor despite their size. Its yellow eyes fixed on Grok with the intense focus of a predator, sizing up potentially dangerous prey, reading every micro-expression, every subtle shift in posture that might indicate weakness or opportunity. Saliva dripped from its half-open jaws, revealing fangs as long as a man's fingers and infinitely sharper than any stone blade they could craft. "Any alpha hunter awake?" Grok suddenly bellowed, his voice carrying a desperate edge that cut through the cave like a flint knife through flesh. It was not just a call to his own band members, but a primal cry that reached back through millions of years of evolution, summoning every fighting instinct that had allowed their species to survive in a world full of creatures larger, stronger, and better armed than they were. The effect on his band was immediate and electric. Bren stepped up beside him despite his crippled arm, his good hand steady on his spear, as battle scars that had seemed like weaknesses suddenly became badges of experience and survival. Old Mac, who moments before had seemed too frail to climb another step, straightened his bent back and raised his own weapon with hands that no longer trembled. Even young Tem found courage he didn't know he possessed, moving to join the defensive line with Jorak's spear clutched in his white-knuckled grip. But it was Kira's response that shocked them all the most. The sound that tore from her throat was not quite human, part howl of grief, part roar of rage, part battle cry that had echoed through countless prehistoric conflicts between predator and prey. "I am awake," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion that had finally found an outlet other than sorrow. "I am here. We are all here." The transformation in her was stunning to witness. The broken female who had lain motionless in cold ashes for days straightened to her full height, every muscle in her compact frame suddenly coiled with lethal purpose. Her eyes, which had been dull with grief for so long, now blazed with the fierce intelligence that had made her legendary among their people. This was Kira the Tracker, Kira the Hunter, Kira who could read danger in a bent grass stem and find water where others saw only barren rock. She began to move in a pattern that the others recognized from their hunting days, the slow, deliberate circle that allowed multiple attackers to confuse and disorient a larger predator. Her selected stones flew with deadly accuracy, not aimed to kill, but to sting and enrage. to make the lion turn its attention from one target to another in frustration and growing anger. The cave lion roared its response, a sound so powerful that several of the children began to weep openly, despite Nala's attempts to comfort them. But instead of charging immediately as they had expected, the great cat began its own circling pattern, looking for weakness in their formation, testing their resolve with feints and mock charges that never quite culminated in actual attack. "He's thinking," Bren observed with grudging admiration. "Smart hunter. Knows we're dangerous together, looking for a way to separate us, pick off weakest first." His scarred face was grim but determined as he tracked the lion's movements with his spear point. "But we stay together. Stay strong. We might just make him decide we're more trouble than we're worth." The standoff stretched taut like a bowstring ready to snap, predator and prey locked in a deadly dance that would determine whether their small band would see another sunrise or become just another layer of bones on this ancient killing floor. The cave lion's patience finally snapped like a dry branch under too much weight. With a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain, the massive predator launched itself forward in a blur of golden muscle and deadly intent. Its powerful hindquarters propelled it across the bone-littered floor with terrifying speed, claws extended to rake and tear, jaws gaping wide to reveal the ivory daggers that had ended countless lives in this very chamber. Grok met the charge head-on, his bone-tipped spear thrust forward with all the strength his massive frame could muster. The point struck the lion's shoulder and penetrated deep into muscle and sinew, eliciting a scream of rage and pain that echoed off the cave walls like the voice of an angry mountain spirit. But the cat's momentum was too great to be stopped by a single blow. Its weight crashed into Grok's body and sent both combatants tumbling across the uneven floor in a deadly embrace of tooth and claw against determination and crude steel. "Now!" Kira screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos like a flint blade. While he's focused on Grok, strike from the sides. Her own actions matched her words as she darted forward with movements that flowed like water over stone, her carefully selected throwing stones flying with lethal precision toward the lion's head and flanks. Each missile struck with enough force to draw blood and enrage the great cat further, but more importantly, they divided its attention between multiple threats. Bren circled to the lion's left, his scarred face a mask of concentration as he waited for the perfect moment to strike. Despite his crippled arm, his good hand was steady as granite as he thrust his spear toward the cat's exposed ribs. The point found its mark, sliding between bones to pierce vital organs, but the lion's reflexive swipe with its massive paw caught Bren across the chest and sent him flying backward to crash against the cave wall with bone-jarring force. "Uncle Bren!" Tem cried, his adolescent voice cracking with fear and fury. Without thinking, the young male charged forward with Jorak's spear raised above his head, his awkward limbs finally finding the coordination that comes with desperate purpose. The weapon descended in a killing arc that would have done his mentor proud, the stone point driving deep into the lion's back, just behind the shoulder blades. The great cat spun with impossible speed despite its wounds, its claws raking across Tem's exposed arm, and opening 4 parallel gashes that painted the cave floor with bright arterial blood. The boy stumbled backward, crying out in pain, but refusing to drop his weapon, his young face pale with shock, but set with the same determination that had carried his people through countless generations of survival. Old Mac, moving with a speed that belied his ancient joints, darted forward like a striking snake to drive his own spear into the lion's hindquarters. "For the cubs!" he wheezed, his weathered voice filled with fierce joy at finally facing an enemy he could fight with steel and courage, instead of time and failing strength. "For the future of the band!" The wounded predator was magnificent in its fury, spinning and slashing at its multiple tormentors with the desperate ferocity of a creature that knew it was fighting for its life. Blood flowed from dozens of wounds, painting its golden coat with dark streams that caught the flickering light of their small fire. But each wound only seemed to make it more dangerous, more desperate, more willing to expend its remaining strength in one final, devastating attack. Nala had gathered the youngest children into the deepest recess of the cave, her own body forming a living shield between them and the violence that raged just beyond their hiding place. "Stay down," she whispered fiercely to little Fen and the others, who clustered around her like chicks seeking protection from a hawk. "The hunters fight for us. We stay quiet, stay hidden, stay alive." Grok, bleeding from multiple claw wounds but still standing, managed to work his way behind the lion while it focused on the other attackers. His massive hands closed around the beast's throat in a grip that had the strength to crush stone, applying pressure to the vital arteries that carried blood to the predator's brain. "Die, you magnificent bastard," he grunted through gritted teeth, his own blood flowing freely from gashes across his chest and arms. "Die, so our children can live." But it was Kira who delivered the killing blow. Moving with the fluid grace that had made her legendary among their people, she slipped past the lion's weakening defenses to drive her bone knife deep into the great artery that ran beneath its jaw. Hot blood sprayed across her hands and face as the predator's life poured out onto the cave floor, mixing with the ancient stains left by countless previous kills. The mighty cave lion shuddered once, twice, then slowly collapsed onto its side among the bones of its former victims. Its yellow eyes, which had burned with such terrible intelligence and predatory focus, gradually dulled until they reflected nothing more than the dying light of their fire. The silence that followed was deafening after the fury of battle, broken only by the ragged breathing of wounded hunters and the distant rumble of the storm that still raged outside their stone shelter. "Is it over?" Tem asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he stared at the massive corpse that dominated the center of their refuge. Blood still seeped slowly from his wounded arm, but he seemed oblivious to the pain as he gazed at the fallen predator with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Kira knelt beside the lion's still form, her hands trembling as she touched the thick fur that would never again ripple with deadly purpose. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying a finality that seemed to acknowledge more than just the end of their immediate danger. "It's over. We are alive. We are together. We are strong." For the first time since Jorak's death, something like peace settled over her features as she looked around at her battered but breathing band members. They had faced death together and emerged victorious, proving once again that their species' greatest strength lay not in fang or claw, but in their willingness to fight as one united force against the darkness. The storm outside had finally begun to weaken, its furious howling reduced to a steady murmur that no longer threatened to tear them from the cliff face should they venture beyond their stone sanctuary. Inside the cave, the aftermath of battle revealed itself in the pale light that filtered through the entrance, blood, both predator and human, staining the ancient bone floor in dark pools that would take days to fully dry and absorb into the thirsty stone. Kira moved among her wounded band members with movements that seemed to flow from some deep well of knowledge she had forgotten she possessed. Her hands, steady despite the tremors of exhaustion and fading battle fury, worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended injuries countless times during the harsh seasons of their nomadic existence. The herbs and healing plants she carried in her worn gathering pouch had survived the desperate climb, and now she used them with the same precision she had once applied to tracking prey. "Hold still, young hunter," she murmured to Tem as she cleaned the 4 parallel gashes that decorated his forearm, like some primitive tattoo earned through courage and blood. The boy gritted his teeth against the pain, but his eyes never left her face as she worked. "Your Jorak would be proud of this strike you made. Clean wounds deep enough to matter, but missing the major blood paths. You fought like a true member of our band." Tem's face flushed with pride, despite the agony of having his wounds cleansed with stinging plant juices that would prevent the rot that killed more hunters than claws or fangs ever did. "I felt him with me," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible over the background sounds of the cave's other activities. "When I charged, it was like his hands guided the spear, like he was still teaching me, even in death." Across the cave, Nala worked to splint Bren's damaged ribs with strips of hide and straight pieces of bone, salvaged from the lion's previous victims. The scarred hunter's breathing came in short, careful gasps that spoke of internal injuries that would heal slowly, if at all, but his eyes remained alert and focused on the tactical situation that still surrounded them. "We can't stay here long," he wheezed, wincing as Nala tightened the bindings around his chest. "Other predators will smell the blood, smell the fresh kill, could draw scavengers, could draw worse things, and the flooding below. We need to know when the waters recede enough to let us move on to better shelter." Grok, despite bearing the worst of the lion's claws across his massive chest and shoulders, had refused treatment until everyone else's wounds were tended. Now he sat patiently, as old Mac worked to stitch the deepest gashes closed with sinew thread and a bone needle, his weathered face impassive despite the pain that must have been nearly overwhelming. The Alpha's willingness to endure suffering for the good of his people was not lost on any of them, reinforcing the bonds of loyalty that held their small band together. "The meat," Grok said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the quiet conversations that had been helping them all process their survival of the desperate battle. "We can't let the lion's body go to waste. Good meat, enough to feed us for many days while we recover. And the hide," his eyes moved to where Kira still wore Jorak's torn fur around her shoulders. "Strong hide, warm hide, could make winter clothing for the children." The practical implications of their victory were becoming clear as the initial shock and exhaustion began to fade. They had not merely survived an attack, they had claimed a prize that could sustain them through the difficult transition ahead. The cave lion's death would provide food, clothing, bone tools and sinew for countless uses. Nothing would be wasted, as was the way of their people who had learned to extract every possible benefit from the dangerous world around them. Little Fen emerged from the cave's deepest recess, where Nala had hidden her during the fight, her small eyes wide with curiosity and lingering fear as she approached the massive corpse that dominated their shelter. "Is it really dead?" she whispered, her tiny hand reaching out to touch the thick fur before pulling back at the last moment. "It won't wake up and hurt us? It's really dead, little star," Kira assured her, using the pet name Jorak had coined for the child during the brief, happy time when their band had been complete and unbroken. "We killed it together, all of us working as one. That's how our people survive, not by being stronger than our enemies, but by being smarter, by fighting together when we must." As she spoke, Kira realized that something fundamental had shifted within her during the desperate battle. The crushing weight of grief that had pressed down on her spirit like a great stone was still there, would always be there, as a reminder of what she had lost. But alongside it now was something else, a fierce protective instinct that extended beyond her own sorrow to encompass the entire band of survivors who looked to her for guidance and strength. "Jorak's spirit fought with us today," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she gave voice to thoughts that had been forming throughout the long ordeal. "I felt him in every throw, every strike, every moment when we chose to stand and fight rather than flee or surrender. He is gone from the world of flesh and breath, but his courage lives on in all of us." Old Mac looked up from his work stitching Grok's wounds, his ancient eyes bright with understanding. "The dead live on in the actions of those they leave behind," he said, his voice carrying the weight of countless seasons of accumulated wisdom. "Every skill he taught, every lesson he shared, every moment of courage he inspired, these things don't die with the body. They become part of the band's strength, part of our survival." Outside their cave sanctuary, the first tentative rays of sunlight began to pierce the storm clouds, casting long beams of gold and amber across the rain-washed landscape. The worst of the tempest had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by water and wind, but still recognizable as the territory they had learned to call home. Soon they would need to assess the damage, plan their next move, decide whether to remain in this bloody sanctuary or seek new shelter elsewhere. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, they were simply a family of survivors, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence, tending their wounds and mourning their losses, while celebrating the fact that they had lived to see another day in their harsh and unforgiving world. 3 days had passed since their desperate battle with the cave lion, and the transformation within their small band was as dramatic as the change in weather outside their stone shelter. The storm clouds had finally cleared completely, revealing a landscape washed clean by the torrential rains and gleaming under the bright sun of a new season. More importantly, the floodwaters in the ravine below had receded enough to reveal safe passage to the river caves they had originally sought. Shelter that would provide both security and access to the resources they needed for long-term survival. Kira stood at the cave entrance, no longer the broken figure who had lain motionless in cold ashes, but something harder and more focused than she had been even before Jorak's death. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been forged into something useful by the fires of necessity and battle. Her eyes, once dull with sorrow, now burned with renewed purpose as she studied the terrain below and planned their descent to better shelter. "Their path is clear," she announced to the band, her voice carrying the authority that came naturally to someone whose skills had proven essential to their collective survival. "Watermarks show the flood peaked 2 hands of sun movement above the normal level, but it's back within the banks now. We can reach the river caves before the sun sets, establish proper shelter before another storm system moves through." Behind her, the others worked with efficient coordination to prepare for the move. Bren, despite his broken ribs and the pain that etched lines around his eyes, supervised the careful butchering of the lion's carcass. Nothing would be wasted. Meat was being cut into strips for drying, hide was being scraped clean for tanning, bones were being sorted according to their potential uses as tools or weapons. Even the great cat's fangs and claws would become implements for cutting and piercing, turning the predator's own weapons against future dangers. "Look at this," Tem called out, his voice bright with excitement, despite the bandages that wrapped his healing arm. He held up a long bone from the lion's leg that had split perfectly along its length, creating what would become an excellent spear shaft, once properly shaped and hardened. Jorak always said the best weapons come from the strongest enemies. This will make a spear worthy of an alpha hunter. Grok, his massive frame crisscrossed with fresh scars that would serve as permanent reminders of their battle, nodded approvingly at the boy's observation. "You think like a hunter now, not just a gatherer," he rumbled, his deep voice warm with genuine approval. "Your foster father's training shows in how you see opportunity, where others might see only meat and bone." The praise brought color to Tem's cheeks, but more importantly, it reflected a truth that had emerged from their shared ordeal. The young male was no longer the awkward adolescent who had trailed behind the adults, seeking scraps of knowledge and approval. The battle had forged him into something harder and more capable, a true member of the band whose contributions would be valued and respected. Old Mac, whose ancient joints had somehow found new strength during the crisis, worked methodically to prepare fire-making supplies from the lion's rendered fat and carefully dried tinder. "Never know when we'll need flame in a hurry again," he wheezed, his weathered hands steady despite their tremor of age. "This fat will catch spark even in wet conditions, burn long and hot when we need it most." Little Fen had overcome her initial fear of the dead predator, and now helped Nala sort the various bones according to size and shape, her small fingers surprisingly deft at identifying pieces that would serve specific purposes. "This one looks like a needle," she announced proudly, holding up a thin splinter that would indeed serve for sewing once properly sharpened and smoothed. "And this one could be a awl for making holes in hide." The child's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding them all that survival was not merely about enduring hardship, but about building toward a future where such skills would be passed down to the next generation. In teaching Fen to see tools where others might see refuse, they were investing in the band's long-term prosperity and continuity. Kira moved away from the entrance and knelt beside the small pile of belongings that represented everything she had left of her life with Jorak. His spear, now carried by Tem, his sleeping furs, which had sheltered her through the worst of her grief, his flint-knapping tools, which she had used to help prepare weapons for their defense. Each item carried memories that were both painful and precious, but she no longer felt crushed by their weight. "We'll carry his memory with us," she said quietly, though her words were meant for the entire band rather than any single listener. "Not as a burden that slows our steps, but as strength that helps us face whatever dangers lie ahead. He would want us to live, to thrive, to protect the young ones who will carry our blood and our knowledge into the future." Nala approached and placed a gentle hand on Kira's shoulder, her weathered face soft with understanding. "You have found your way back to us," she observed, her voice warm with the affection of someone who had watched Kira grow from an impetuous young female into a wise and capable adult. Different than before, perhaps harder in some ways, but still the strong hunter and tracker we depend on. "Different, yes," Kira agreed, standing and shouldering the pack that contained their most essential supplies, "but not broken, never broken, as long as the band needs me." She looked around at the faces that had become more precious to her than her own life during their shared ordeal. "We are ready to leave this place of death and find a home where we can build new life. The river caves will shelter us through the cold season, and when spring comes we'll be strong enough to establish our own territory." As they prepared to descend from their bloody sanctuary toward the promise of better shelter below, each member of the band carried within them the knowledge that they had faced the ultimate test and emerged not just alive, but stronger than before. The widow who had slept in ashes had awakened to become a protector of her people, and the alpha who had called for hunters had found them ready to answer, no matter how desperate the circumstances or how impossible the odds against their survival. The river caves exceeded even Kira's memories of their potential as a permanent shelter, carved by countless seasons of flowing water into the limestone cliffs that bordered the valley. They formed a network of interconnected chambers that could house their entire band with room for growth and expansion. The main cavern opened onto a broad ledge that provided both security from ground-based predators and a commanding view of the territory they were claiming as their own. Most importantly, fresh water flowed constantly through a natural channel that had been carved into the cave floor by millennia of patient erosion. The stream was deep enough to provide drinking water for many times their current numbers, clean enough to support the fish that would supplement their diet during the lean seasons, and reliable enough to ensure they would never again face the desperate thirst that had driven them from their previous territory. "This could be home," Grok announced as he stood on the ledge surveying the valley spread below them, like a vast hunting ground waiting to be explored and exploited. His massive frame was silhouetted against the afternoon sun, and the fresh scars across his chest and shoulders caught the light like badges of honor, earned through courage and blood. Good water, good hunting, good shelter. Everything a growing band needs to prosper. Below them, the valley showed clear signs of the recent flooding, but also of the incredible fertility that such seasonal inundations brought to the soil. Green shoots were already emerging from the rain-soaked earth, promising abundant plant foods in the coming warm season. Game trails crisscrossed the valley floor like a network of highways, indicating that this territory supported large numbers of the animals their hunters would need to track and kill for survival. Kira moved through the caves with the systematic thoroughness that had made her legendary among their people, cataloging every advantage and potential danger that their new home presented. The limestone walls were dry despite the recent rains, indicating good drainage that would prevent the dampness that could sicken young children and elderly band members during the cold seasons. Natural alcoves provided storage space for food and tools, while narrow passages offered escape routes if their main chamber was ever threatened by enemies. "The back chambers extend much deeper than I remembered," she reported to the others as she returned from her exploration. "Some reach so far into the mountain that they stay cool even in the hottest weather, perfect for preserving meat during the warm seasons, and the narrow entrances can be easily defended if necessary." Tem had established himself near the cave mouth, where he could practice with his new spear while maintaining watch over the approaches to their shelter. The weapon he had crafted from the cave lion's leg bone was perfectly balanced for his growing frame, and the stone point he had napped under Mac's patient instruction was sharp enough to penetrate even thick hide. His movements as he practiced hunting techniques showed a fluidity and confidence that had been entirely absent during his awkward adolescent phase. "Movement in the valley," he called out, his voice carrying just the right note of alertness without alarm. "Large animals, but moving like prey, not predators. Auroch herd, maybe, or giant deer. Good hunting if we can get close enough." Old Mac hobbled over to observe the distant shapes that moved through the tall grass, like shadows given substance. His ancient eyes, clouded though they were with age, could still read the stories written in movement and behavior better than most of the younger hunters. "Auroch," he confirmed after a long moment of study. "Young bull separated from main herd, probably by the flooding. Good meat, enough to feed us for many days while we establish ourselves here." The prospect of fresh meat sent a ripple of excitement through the band, but also served to highlight how much their circumstances had improved since their desperate flight from the drought-stricken wasteland they had been forced to abandon. Here was territory worth defending, resources worth protecting, a foundation upon which they could build not just survival, but prosperity for future generations. Nala had taken charge of organizing their temporary camp within the main cavern, her weathered hands working with practiced efficiency to create defined areas for sleeping, food preparation, tool-making, and the other activities that would structure their daily lives. The lion's hide, properly cured and treated, would provide warm bedding for the children during the cold season, while the smaller pieces of fur would become clothing and weather protection for the adults. "We'll need to establish territorial markers soon," Bren observed, his voice still careful due to his healing ribs, but carrying the tactical awareness that made him invaluable despite his physical limitations. "Other bands will be looking for new territory too, especially if the drought was widespread. We need to make it clear that this valley is claimed, that we're prepared to defend it." Little Fen had discovered that the cave walls created wonderful echoes when she sang the simple songs that her people used to mark the passage of days and seasons. Her clear voice filled the cavern with melodies that seemed to drive away the shadows and make their new home feel more like a place where families could grow and thrive, rather than simply survive from one crisis to the next. "The acoustics are good," Kira noted with satisfaction as she listened to the child's impromptu concert. "Sound carries well through the chambers, which means we'll hear anyone approaching long before they can reach us, and the echoes will make it difficult for enemies to determine exactly where we are if they do manage to penetrate our defenses." As the sun began to set over their new domain, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that promised good weather for the immediate future, the band gathered around their first fire in what they were already beginning to think of as home. The flames cast dancing shadows on the limestone walls, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories of all the people who had sheltered here before them and all who would come after. "Tomorrow we hunt," Grok announced, his deep voice carrying the satisfaction of a leader who had successfully guided his people through catastrophe to something approaching prosperity. "Tomorrow, we mark our territory and begin to build the life we will pass down to our children and their children. Tonight we rest in safety, surrounded by the family that makes all struggles worthwhile." For the first time since Jorak's death, Kira felt something approaching contentment settle over her spirit, like a warm hide on a cold night. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer dominated every thought and sensation. Instead, it had become part of the foundation upon which she would build her new life as protector and provider for the people who had become more precious to her than her own existence. The morning of their first hunt in the new territory dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant objects seem close enough to touch and filled every breath with the promise of good fortune. Kira stood at the cave entrance, her body painted with the traditional ochre markings that her people used to honor successful hunts and important ceremonies. But these were not the simple patterns of routine hunting. These were the complex symbols reserved for moments when the very survival of the band hung in the balance. Behind her, the rest of the hunting party made their final preparations with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to work together as a single organism during times of crisis. Grok's massive frame moved with surprising grace despite his recent injuries. His new spear, crafted from the cave lion's thigh bone and tipped with the finest stone point old Mac could create, held with the confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. Tem adjusted the hide strappings that held his own weapon. The nervousness that had once characterized his every movement, now replaced by a focused intensity that reminded everyone of Jorak's hunting stance. The boy had grown into himself during their ordeal, his awkward adolescent frame finally finding the coordination and strength that would make him a formidable provider for the band in the seasons to come. "The auroch is still separated from his herd," Kira reported, after a careful study of the valley below. "Grazing in the marsh grass near the bend in the river, where the soft ground will slow his escape, but also make our approach more difficult. We'll need to circle wide to stay downwind, use the tall reeds for cover until we're close enough for killing strikes." Even as she outlined their hunting strategy, part of her mind was engaged in the deeper process of teaching and learning that would ensure their band's knowledge survived to benefit future generations. Every decision, every tactical choice, every reading of wind and terrain was being absorbed by the younger hunters who would someday lead their own expeditions into the dangerous world beyond their cave sanctuary. "Bren will take the high ground," she continued, acknowledging the scarred hunter's limitations while utilizing his strengths. "His damaged ribs won't let him charge with the rest of us, but his spear-throwing arm is still the strongest in our band. He can provide covering strikes while the rest of us close for the kill." The hunt itself unfolded with the brutal efficiency that was necessary for survival in their harsh world. The auroch, massive and powerful despite being separated from his protective herd, fought with the desperate fury of a creature that knew death was approaching on swift feet and sharp spears. His great horns swept in killing arcs that could crush bones or open arteries. His hooves struck the marshy ground with enough force to shatter skulls. His bellow of rage and defiance echoed across the valley like thunder from a clear sky. But against the coordinated attack of experienced hunters working as a unified team, even his impressive strength and ferocity were not enough. Kira's tracking skills had positioned them perfectly for the ambush. Grok's raw power drove his spear deep into vital organs. Tem's newfound confidence allowed him to strike at precisely the right moment, and Bren's thrown weapons found their marks when they were most needed. When the great beast finally fell, his life flowing out onto the rich earth that would nourish the grass that would feed future herds, the hunters stood around his massive form with the reverent silence that their people had always shown toward the animals, whose deaths made their own lives possible. This was not mere killing for sport or dominance, but the sacred exchange that allowed one form of life to sustain another through the endless cycle of survival and death that governed their world. "Enough meat to last through the cold season," Grok observed with deep satisfaction as he began the careful process of field dressing their kill. enough hide to clothe the children and provide shelter materials for expanding our cave dwellings, enough bone to make tools and weapons for seasons to come. As they worked to process their prize, other members of the band appeared from the caves to help transport the valuable resources back to their new home. Little Fen danced around the edges of the butchering site, her young voice raised in the traditional songs of thanksgiving that honored both the successful hunters and the spirit of the animal that had given its life to sustain them. "Will there be enough for everyone?" she asked, her small face serious with the responsibility she felt toward ensuring no member of their family went hungry during the difficult times that lay ahead. "Enough for everyone, and guests too, if other bands come to trade during the warm season," Kira assured her, ruffling the child's hair with hands still stained with the aurochs' blood. "This territory can support a much larger band than we are now. Someday when you're grown and have children of your own, there might be 20 families living in these caves, all tracing their lineage back to the survivors who claimed this valley." As the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the successful hunters made their way back to the caves that were already beginning to feel like home rather than merely shelter. Behind them, scavengers would clean the last traces of their kill from the marsh grass, returning even the bones to the earth that had given them life. Nothing would be wasted, nothing would be forgotten, and the cycle of existence would continue as it had since the earliest days of their kind. That evening, as they gathered around their fire in the main cavern to share the first fresh meat they had tasted in many days, Kira looked around at the faces illuminated by the dancing flames and felt a peace settle over her spirit that she had thought lost forever with Jorak's death. These people, scarred by battle, hardened by necessity, bound together by shared struggle and mutual dependence, were her family in the truest sense of the word. "We have survived," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of all the challenges they had faced and overcome together. "We have found new territory, established our dominance over it, and proven that our band possesses the strength and wisdom necessary to prosper in this harsh world. Jorak's spirit lives on in every skill he taught us, every lesson he shared, every moment of courage he inspired." Grok raised his drinking gourd in a toast that included both the living and the dead. "To the future of our band," he declared, his deep voice echoing off the limestone walls. "To the children who will carry our blood and our knowledge into tomorrow. To the hunters who stand ready when the Alpha calls. To the widow who rose from ashes to become our protector and guide. To the future," they all replied in unison, their voices blending into a harmony that seemed to promise better days ahead, despite all the dangers and hardships that would inevitably come. To the band, to survival, to life itself. Outside their cave sanctuary, the valley settled into the peaceful quiet of evening, secure under the protection of hunters who had proven their worth in blood and fire, ready to provide for generations yet to be born in this territory they had claimed as their own.